wicked. Okay, so I want to introduce Jason Clay. Jason is the Vice President for Markets and Executive Director of the Markets Institute at the World Wildlife Fund, which is quite an interesting combination. But he's been focusing on the power of markets to address our sustainability problems from WWF for over 10 years now. And a lot of the ideas that Paul Pullman has and Jeff Seabright and Valerie Keller have for getting Imagine going are built on Jason's work. It's his idea of pre-competitive collaboration. So when I first started talking to Paul about connecting with this class, he said, you got to talk to Jason. Jason's the expert on that. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Jason. We have until 2:20. I have 2 mics, and when it comes time for Q&A, I'll handle the mics, and you handle the answers, okay?
Okay, sounds fun.
All yours.
So thanks for inviting me to come and talk. I want to talk about different kinds of pre-competitive collaboration where people and institutions are working together to solve common problems. I think another name for this, which is just as apt, is uncommon collaboration, because what we're really talking about is institutions and individuals that have been antagonistic in the past. And this kind of communication and these kinds of platforms don't just happen. They have to be created and people have to see the value in them. So I think one of the other things that I'd like to introduce now is the concept of what I call the extrapreneur. It's the NGOs and the consulting firms and the individual consultants that talk to people that don't talk to each other. They're like the honeybees in the system. They gather information and then pollinate a lot of other flowers with it as they move through and talk to different people. Just keep that in mind as we move through this conversation. So the Oromo in Ethiopia have a saying that goes, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. And I think this pretty well sums up the predicament that we're in the 21st century. The problems have become so large and we've reached the extent of using most of the Earth's resources. We've now got climate change that's coming into the mix, and we've got some business models that perhaps aren't fit for purpose anymore that need to either be tinkered with or maybe changed dramatically. But what we're finding is that we're actually winning battles and losing wars. It takes us too long to actually have results on the ground. Between when we see an issue and when we can actually have measurable results to address it, it's 30, 40, 50 years, whether it's deforestation, overfishing, pesticides, you name it. Now it's kind of soil health is one of those big issues. The problem going forward is that in the next 40 years, we have to produce as much as we have in the last 8,000 years. And agriculture and food production already are the biggest single impacts of people on the planet. So the question is, how do we freeze the footprint of food? How do we produce twice as much with no more or even less land, less water, fewer pesticides, fewer fertilizers and inputs, etc.? And maybe then the next question is, whose responsibility really is it? When the average consumer in the US takes about 2.5 to 3 seconds to make a choice, and in Europe, maybe a lot longer at 5 seconds, they're not really going to be driving the kind of change we need to see on the ground. Governments are finding it hard today to manage a piece of the planet, much less the whole planet. And so that's why default, we've kind of focused on business. Businesses are actually seeing the planet as where they do their work. It's where they buy their resources. It's where they sell their products. For businesses, they have much more of a global perspective than any country or any consumer. So we think businesses are at least part of the solution and can maybe drive the awareness of other pieces of the solution as well. But in the 21st century, it's pretty clear that sustainability isn't a label on a package. In fact, it's not even the positioning of a product on the shelf. Sustainability is fundamentally pre-competitive. We've got to figure out how to where and how materials are being produced and how companies can shift their attention from what they control, the problems they own, to the ones that are embedded in the products they sell. because no matter what a company does in its own shops or its own infrastructure, anywhere from 40 to 60 to 70% of the impacts of the products are coming from where and how they're produced. So put another way, no company by itself is big enough to change global commodity markets. Walmart's the largest buyer of cotton. It buys about 2.4% of global cotton. And if you look at every other commodity, it's that way. So how do we start working together to change some of these issues? And why do companies want to do it? So part of the issue is risk. And it's not just risk about the reputation, but again, reputational risk is quite significant in an era of social media. Within 6 seconds, a photo can be posted on the web of anybody's supply chain anywhere in the world. And if you're not aware of that, the signal you're sending is that you don't care what's being shown in those pictures. But it's also about availability of raw materials. As there are more people, as they have more money, as they consume differently, what we're finding is that the availability of raw materials isn't certain anymore. As we see certain economies grow, like Asia, the availability of US and European companies to simply go out and buy what they want, produced how they want, is also a little bit more difficult. And with climate change, we're finding that companies are actually pivoting their purchases. They can't rely on a single area anymore. They have to double supply chains. And if we're not careful, that means being more inefficient. So all of these things begin to add up. Now, I want to just go briefly through various types and various points at which we see pre-competitive behavior and talk about what some of the strengths and lessons learned and weaknesses of these different strategies are. But I'm going to be covering a lot of material, and so what I will say is this. If you have a question, you may not get an answer today, but write it down and we'll work out how you get the questions to me, and I'll get you answers at least by the weekend, if not before. So there's pre-competitive behavior at several key points in the supply chain. We saw in 2006 that global soy traders worked together with Greenpeace, the Nature Conservancy, WWF, and Conservation International to develop a soy moratorium in the Amazon, where they agreed that they wouldn't buy soy produced with deforestation in the Amazon. Now, it wasn't a huge lift for them because soy from the Amazon was a tiny part of Brazilian production, but it was the first time traders had actually worked together to take on an issue that was more consumer-driven or driven by the retailers and brands than was necessitated by business itself. Right after that, we saw the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a forum of about 400 global companies with several $1 trillion worth of business. They came out with a program to take deforestation out of their supply chains. It was in 2010, and they focused on 4 commodities: beef, soy, palm oil, and pulp, because those were the most important ones. And they focused on 2 countries. But what we found with the Consumer Goods Forum was that they never actually shared information about what each of the companies was doing to reduce deforestation, what pressure they could bring to bear on the traders or on the meatpacking companies to get deforestation free to be a common thing that they were all looking for. And so they never achieved their 2020 commitments, which was that they would have deforestation out of their supply chains. There's another type of pre-competitive approach where a country actually created a program where all producers had to submit information to the government about how they were producing food products that were for export, what the key impacts were, what they were doing to reduce them. This information went onto a website and was available to other producers. It's the only country that's ever done this. And today, 90% of all milk production in Ireland is the producers share information about how they reduce their impacts. The same as 80% of all beef producers do. Now, they didn't do this out of the goodness of their heart. They did this because Ireland was caught exporting quote unquote beef to Europe, which happened to be horse meat. So they had a huge reputational issue that they had to fix, and this is how they chose to do it. But even so, that's a lesson for other countries. There's a lot of discussion today about jurisdictional approaches. The ultimate jurisdiction right now is the nation state. And we're doing a lot of things we do through companies, through certification programs, et cetera, because nation states aren't actually doing their job. So in Ireland, they're trying to actually begin to do their job. And it's going to be interesting to see if other countries pick up from them. One of the most effective form of instances of pre-competitive behavior is with the Global Salmon Aquaculture Initiative, where 17 CEOs agreed to work together to have their products certified, but also to measurably reduce the key impacts and to post all this information of the whole industry about continuous improvement on the web so consumers and others could see it. And what's amazing about it is it's the first time that I've ever seen a global commodity group who are fierce competitors in the marketplace begin to see that working together is the best way to improve the reputation of the whole industry. What the leaders of salmon aquaculture found was that if they didn't work together, the reputation of the industry was defined by whatever the newspaper article was about the worst performers. So the best performers realized they need to share data with the worst performers so that everybody could get better. And this is what they've accomplished by comparison to the FSC certification program, which has gotten to 16% after 20 years or so. The MSC, which has gotten to 12% after 15 to 20 years. This is what happened with salmon because they shared their data, because they worked together. They've had more than 40% of their total product globally certified and 60% of the companies that are participating in this. So this is the kind of behavior we need to see happen where it's not, sustainability is not a competitive issue. It's actually something where everybody can learn from everybody else. I don't know how many of you have been following some of the recent press about Mars and chocolate, but basically companies in the cocoa business have found that there are a lot of attacks on them around child labor, around poverty, around diseases in the cocoa trees, and then deforestation to try to expand plantings elsewhere. They all came together to create the World Cocoa Foundation, and this is what they were trying to address. These are probably 8 of the most important indicators of sustainability of cocoa, and each of them is going in the wrong direction as of today. So what happened was they agreed on the issues. They agreed even on how you would measure improvement. And then each of the companies went off and did their own thing without sharing information, without learning from each other, et cetera. So they have actually failed. Deforestation is still going up. There's still the producers of cocoa that are certified or verified, their children are just as likely to be malnourished or stunted as producers that aren't certified. Deforestation is still running amok. Child labor is still rampant. And so these are issues that they have not been able to address because they have refused to work together. So they got together about the issues, but they couldn't get together about sharing data to actually have viable solutions on the ground. I think most people who think about free competition think that it's a group of retailers or brands that get together, or in the case of salmon, maybe a group of producers. But I think we're now beginning to see a pivot where supply chains themselves are beginning to be seen as pre-competitive. And what I mean by that is that they're much less adversarial than ever before, and people actually see long-term partnerships beginning to develop, even with long-term contracts between buyers and sellers. They're all in it together. If one fails, they all fail. And so this is a new kind of pre-competitive behavior that's becoming important. The first time I realized this was in the late 90s when I was asked to interview in front of a group of people in Papua New Guinea, three people from different parts of the tropical timber trade. One was a guy who operated a walkabout sawmill in the forest itself, cutting down trees, sawing them into boards, and carrying them out to the market. The second was an exporter of sawn material that went mostly to Europe. And the third was the importer in the Netherlands that was the largest single importer. And what we created was, in front of everybody, and much to the unease of each of the three people I was interviewing, within a half an hour, we created these price and cost curves for how values were created, where costs were, where waste was, etc. The items that are identified in red actually showed us that we could reduce the cost to consumers by 20% and double the profits to the forest exporters, so that we could actually improve the market position of this tropical timber and actually share the equity more equally, with the profit margin for the final retailer still being the same. That was my first realization that we needed to start looking at supply chains as places where nobody had the perspective of the whole, and if we could bring together the different actors, we could see where there was common ground and where we could actually improve the system to actually improve everybody's lot. Another type of supply chain is where an actor drives an action by themselves. In the case of Walmart's 2017 Gigaton Challenge, where they committed that they would reduce their own emissions by a gigaton, but they wanted their supply chains to reduce their gigatons, or excuse me, their greenhouse gas emissions by a gigaton as well. They made it then a requirement for their preferred suppliers not only to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but to tell them and show them what they've been doing. But this was all stick and no carrot. There were no long-term contracts. There was no attempt to purchase the carbon offsets for the saved carbon that came from the supply chain. So it was really just Walmart strong-arming its supply chains to say, if you want to be our supplier, this is what you're going to do. That's not normally the kind of pre-competitive behavior that actually leads to the greatest results. Then there's what I would call pre-competitive behavior that's becoming more and more common, or needs to become more and more common, about sharing information and knowledge. Today we have about 150 operations of vertical agriculture in the U.S. None of them share information with each other, so each is on a very steep learning curve. And none of them have taken into account some very interesting things, like no one is using stranded assets. No one's using power from power plants to actually set up a joint venture with a power plant who might want some carbon offsets by growing food locally. Nobody is using the energy which is going to be generated for the next 30 or 40 years before those power plants, thermal power plants mostly, go out of business. Nobody's locating their operations on brownfields or using post offices, which have a huge amount of excess capacity now to actually deliver produce to consumers. Nobody's focusing on actually food deserts and using their production facility to create jobs, to create nutrition in food deserts, to tap into community funds for investment and other opportunities. And none actually have ever developed a strong partnership, a long-term contract with a local retail partner. We're just doing a project like this that's coming up with a business plan in the city of St. Louis to do all of these things and then make this information available to others. There's a dairy farmer in Indiana called Fair Oaks, and their goal is to create carbon neutral milk. And they're doing it on 3 different farms in 3 different geographies. They're actually focusing on the feed, the animal and plant genetics, reducing the impacts of the ruminants and managing the manure. Their whole goal is to show everybody else how to do this because they want to improve the reputation of animal protein. And they've reduced the carbon embedded in their milk by half already in about 7 or 8 years, and they're hoping by 2030 to be at carbon neutral. That's the kind of information that is useful for everybody. They don't see this as a competitive advantage for them. They see it as something that the milk industry needs to do to show consumers and others that they're doing their effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food. And then it's not just businesses that are beginning to look at pre-competitive behavior. I was approached by the dean of UC Davis who wanted to come and talk to me when she was in Washington at some meetings. And we couldn't find a time during the day to talk, so I invited her to dinner, and I invited 6 other people that had connections to Davis to hear what she had to say and talk. And she came saying, I have 43 tenured positions that are going to be leaving in 3 years' time or over the next 3 years. Who should I hire? What are the types of expertise that we need? What are the ways we need to approach education with climate change? And so I kind of wrote her afterward. We had a discussion. I wrote her afterwards and I said, look, this is something you shouldn't try to be learning by yourself. Why don't we organize the land-grant universities at their next annual meeting and poll them and see who's doing what about climate change, what they can learn from each other. Is there an appetite to create a platform where they actually share information? Because the problem really gets down to something very simple. Today, where we grow cotton in the U.S. is in the South. But this last year, cotton got almost all the way to I-70 in Kansas. Within 20 or 30 years, it'll be at I-80, which is the middle of Iowa. And after that, it'll be in Minnesota. Where we need cotton expertise in universities traditionally is where we grow the cotton, and the system is not accommodating that. So now we've got to figure out how to connect the expertise to the places cotton's being grown, and also how farmers can start feeding data into databases to show what they're doing to react to climate change, weather variability, and the adoption of new crops. We're not thinking about that now, and we need to be. There's also a whole lot of new risk and issues or opportunities where pre-competitive platforms could be really helpful in getting to solutions, getting to understandings, getting to new business models faster. Let me just give you a few examples of some of the ones that are on the horizon. We have made a point of looking at illegality in food after I begin to hear all over the world of illegality being a bigger and bigger issue. What we found when we looked at a number of different commodities and geographies or countries was that in fact it's I think 8 to 10 commodities, 6 to 8 countries, about 50% of food that's traded globally is not produced legally in the country in question. 50% is a huge reputational risk. It's about land and resource rights. It's about compliance with social issues from child labor and slave labor to minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. It's about other kinds of laws, and then it's about fraud and corruption. All of these things, but the first two, the environmental issues and the social issues, are the most important. And if you think this is a developing country issue, you're wrong. Half of the food in the U.S. between production and consumption utilizes illegal labor. And that's an issue we don't even talk about. It's so pervasive that nobody even sees it as being odd. Then there's another issue that I begin to look at. So in California, we've got fires right now, increased heat, but also freezes in the spring, drought, snow melt is happening so fast we can't it can't be regulated without a lot of new dams, et cetera. Land and labor costs are high. California is becoming a place where we can't produce food in a reliable way. Where's the next California? And if you think that's just a U.S. problem, every country in the world has a California. Where's the next one going to be? How do we think about that? We're actually looking now at the mid-delta area of the Mississippi. So most of Arkansas, parts of Missouri, Mississippi, and Tennessee. We think that may be the next one, but it doesn't really matter where the next one is. How do we find it? How do we transition in an orderly way rather than in a chaotic way? We're also finding that one issue that consumers care a lot about and companies are getting more worried about is that whether their raw material producers can make a decent living or not. That's not something that's ever kept them awake at night before, but increasingly we're seeing that of the 800 million or so people that are malnourished and the 150 or 170 million that are stunted, 75% of them are farmers and their families. So how do these people get incorporated into global supply chains in ways that are going to improve their lot in life? And by the way, that same bottom part of the performance curve produces, that bottom 25% by performance produces about 10% of the product of any commodity globally, but about 50% of the impacts. So all the companies want to think that they're only working with the better producers or they're working with the average producers, but every supply chain has people that are in the bottom. If we're going to reduce environmental impacts, we're going to improve livelihoods, we need to focus on the bottom, not just the top. And companies need to do that too, because those people are embedded in their supply chains, particularly with tree crops like palm oil or cocoa or coffee or rubber or cashew nuts or tea or other things. We've got to begin to look at that. And companies need to be working with governments on this. Companies can't pull the whole performance curve over to the right by themselves. Governments have to be involved as well. So how do we get governments engaged? That's going to be a big issue going forward. There's a couple of new tools or market opportunities that I'd also like to talk about that I think pre-competitive platforms and thinking is really going to be helpful with. One is pretty simple. When I was doing trading Brazil nuts in an earlier part of my career, set up a trading company and was buying from forest residents. What I found is if I entered into one-year contracts with them to buy their product, they could take that contract to a bank and borrow working capital against the value of that contract. Well, now we've begun to talk to companies about doing 3, 5, and 10-year contracts to do the same on other types of investments that either address environmental issues, make producers comply with animal welfare issues, or help producers become more resilient to climate change. In this particular case, McDonald's entered into 10-year contracts in Paraguay with a cooperative of 1,000 different producers that own their own processing plant. The condition of McDonald's was they wanted a certain quantity, but the condition was that it had to be deforestation free, and not only what went through the plant that they bought their meat from, but all of the animals that any of the producers sold into that plant, all the rest of their herds had to be deforestation free as well. They needed to make some repairs on the plant because it was, from a phytosanitary perspective, it was perfect. But from an animal welfare perspective, how the animals were handled and how they moved into the plant needed to be upgraded. And then finally, McDonald's put a condition on it, which is not verifiable, but it is aspirational. And that is that each of the producers should double production over the next 10 years, as in amount of production per land, per water, per whatever. And McDonald's didn't say at all how to do this, but they gave them these contracts. The producers went into a bank, they borrowed money at 2 to 5% below market rates because it was a dollar denominated contract with McDonald's, and McDonald's had such pull, they were actually able to get cheaper money. McDonald's didn't pay a premium, but these producers ended up having higher net profits. There isn't, in these contracts, there isn't a 10-year contract for price. There's a price finding mechanism, which is usually based on spot market prices, either one local one or a couple of them that are averaged as representative. The other issue is that soil is a living thing, and it's renewable if we manage it right. And today we're not. So we've got about 250 million hectares of degraded land that could easily be brought back into full production. And the way to do that is for companies who are buying products from raw materials producers. Now they have the ability under the UN and the Paris Agreement to begin to buy carbon, what we call onsets or insets, from their scope 3 producers and suppliers, so that they can buy a ton of carbon with a ton of corn or soybeans or beef or whatever. That, once farmers start measuring not just soil carbon, but reduced input use, increased riparian area protection, and the trees that grow on it and the carbon associated with them, once they start measuring this, we think that these are going to become significant markets. And right now, with commodity prices, any price for carbon is significant. But there is another issue, and it really needs to be acknowledged, and that is that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly, EU and US companies actually could change the world. In 2000, more than 20% of global palm oil went to Europe and the US. Today, it's about 11%. The ability to leverage change in that market is now not very significant. The change comes from India, China, Indonesia. Those are the markets that are driving a lot of these commodities. And so we have to figure out how to extend pre-competitive behavior beyond just the EU and the US to other parts of the world. The salmon people did it with Chilean producers. How can we begin to do this with animal protein producers in China, et cetera? So the issue, I think, going forward isn't what to think, it's how to think. And we've got to figure out how to think about all the things that are happening on the planet much more quickly. Or as they say in Missouri, where I come from, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Think about it. Thank you. I lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jason. What we'll do here is I'll ask for questions. I'll see if anyone has a related question, so we can get more questions on the table, maybe 2 or 3. Jason will answer it and we'll move forward. To kick the ball off, I'd like to start with a question and ask if anyone has what they think go with it. Can you talk a little bit about the line between pre-competitive and competitive? Certainly there are places where sustainability will be a competitive issue. When should a CEO have their antitrust attorney ready to go? Where should they start to get nervous? And I'm thinking, for example, right now that the Trump administration is suing 4 automakers for collaboration over the California auto standards. So where is that line between competitive and pre-competitive? Does anyone have a similar or related question? Okay, why don't we kick off with that, Jason?
So I think the simple way to think about it is pre-competitive behavior is really about how raw materials are produced and putting conditions on what will be purchased. It's somebody mentioned it earlier, I think it was in Pullman's correspondence with you, that part of what we need to do in the 21st century is figure out how to bring environmental externalities back into pricing. And so deforestation-free commodities, that actually begins to address that issue. Buying carbon from your raw material suppliers rather than from some offset half a world away that means nothing to your business is another way to bring those into that sphere. But I think pre-competitive stops when you start differentiating your product in the marketplace. So in the case of the salmon producers, whether you sell whole salmon or smoked salmon or salmon fillets or which markets or which price points, etc., that's all competitive. And that's still super competitive, even with those people that are working together. What's not competitive is, can all 17 of them create enough market demand to create a substitute for fish meal and fish oil that has less impacts than fishing in the ocean? That's where they're actually creating an incentive to get other people involved in helping them solve a problem. Now, also, anything about price is competitive. So that's another issue, and that's why long-term contracts don't include price, because price is something that needs to be negotiated separately. I think that's about enough on that.
Okay. Questions?
Hi, Jason. This is Osman. Thank you for the talk. I had a question about your McDonald's example. What you say is that McDonald's got their vendor to convert to more sustainable practices, and they actually give them the contract, and they didn't have to pay a premium, and they could easily get money from the banks instead at a cheaper rate. My question is that companies are already doing that. I was working with Nestle, for example, and they do it for different terms, for better sales prospects mostly. And there is a trade-off there. How would you say that this trade-off would get the companies to commit in a different state?
I just want to see if there's a couple of other questions. Anyone have a question related to that? Anyone related to that? Okay, Jason, that one's all by itself.
So I think the issue that this example raises is that McDonald's, in effect, is one of the few companies that has run its business on handshakes since its founding. And so they have suppliers that have been suppliers of theirs for 60 years. And each year they go out and have a discussion, they shake their hands, and they go back and do their business. But McDonald's never took advantage of a 10-year contract, which really just put in writing what they're already doing. But it was significant to the producers because they could then use that contract as an asset, as collateral, to borrow money to make investments in becoming more efficient, in investing in collection of byproducts or whatever. The other thing that McDonald's brought into a new market like Paraguay is, from a beef point of view, it's easy to sell steaks. It's easy to sell the cuts of meat. It's hard to sell hamburger. And so if you've got a company that's coming in and willing to buy virtually 50% of the weight of an animal, that's your hardest marketing problem taken away. So there are advantages, I think, to both sides of this. Of course, if McDonald's can get all of its beef to be deforestation-free or conversion-free, then they can talk about it and they can begin to see if consumers actually care or not. We don't know yet.
Hi, this is Carrie, and I'm from CEUS, actually in Shanghai. I'm streaming here right now. When you talk about,
I can't hear you very well.
Hold it closer.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so when you talked about EU and the US companies can't work together to change the global markets alone currently, but have to work with countries like India, China, and Indonesia, how do you propose them working together, especially between competing countries? Is it through like MNCs or intermediaries or through setting standards, for example?
Right. Is there another question related to that? Okay, Jason.
So there's a lot of multinationals that are actually operating in China and buying up Chinese companies and actually converting them to a set of practices that those companies have adopted for U.S. and European markets. So they're raising expectation of Chinese consumers and then other retailers and brands in the Chinese market. It also goes the other way, though. So I remember I was in Chile about 10 or 15 years ago, and we were visiting a forested area in the south of the country where a lot of forests were being used for pulpwood, and they were all FSC certified. I mean, it turns out that Chile was the first country that got 70% of its total production certified against the FSC. And I said, well, why did you guys do this? Because you're selling to China. And they said China required it because they're selling to the US and EU a lot of materials that are packaged, and they want it to be FSC certified packaging. So there's different ways that demand in European and US markets can actually move Chinese companies as well. A similar one is where the largest state-owned enterprise in China in the food industry is COFCO. And COFCO not only imports soy and meat and all kinds of things into China, but it has a trading company now that exports soy from Brazil to Europe. And Europeans want deforestation-free soy. So COFCO now has a line of soy that's deforestation-free. The Chinese Meat Association has also just made a commitment for deforestation-free. They don't know how to achieve it, but they're starting to move in that direction, and I think it's because of the publicity and the press around the issue. China doesn't want to be known as the country that wrecks the world's environment, and this was they made huge numbers of reforms when they came into the WTO because they didn't want to be seen as the country that buys all the lowest value commodities that are produced in the worst possible ways. That's also happening now with some of the key environmental issues. China doesn't want to be associated with deforestation in Brazil. So they're beginning to look beyond that. So I think it's a delicate issue, but I do think there's the ability to move it. In China, it's because a lot of the biggest companies are state-owned. India is another whole kettle of fish where 90% of the businesses are privately owned, and that's going to be much harder to move.
Question.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I have a question. You said specifically sustainability is not a competitive issue. But when we talk about business, we talk about markets, one of the best ways to improve is through that competition. Do you see any way that you can both have competition in sustainability, but also maintain that kind of pre-competitive atmosphere of sharing best practices?
Does anyone have a related question?
Thanks so much. This is Anya Shapiro. On that note, I just had a question about your cocoa example. You kind of alluded to the fact that the effort failed because companies weren't willing to share the data. So it seems like this is going to be a consistent issue in these collaborative ventures moving forward. So how would you recommend that companies deal with that issue, knowing that it is going to be a common concern?
Okay, Jason, there you
go. So I think with regard to the cocoa, I think what other sectors have found is that if they give up their own information, they learn lessons that are very hard and costly for them to learn on their own. That it's like that old saying, we all know more than any one of us do. So if we share information, we're all going to learn faster. What you do with that information can be competitive. It can be your own strategic differentiation in the marketplace, etc. But the fact that cocoa has not been willing to do this means that, and here's a little prediction, within 10 years, cocoa is going to move out of West Africa, which is 70% of global production, because they won't be able to solve the problems. Now, the problems are pretty severe. But I think what we're going to see is they're going to move into entirely different areas using irrigation, full sun cocoa, and they'll build humidified buildings to do the fermentation of the cocoa beans and grow the cocoa basically in deserts that are watered. And the amount of production they're going to get is going to be 10 to 20 times what it is today. The average production in West Africa is 350 kilos per hectare. The average production in trials in Brazil with irrigated land is 6,000. So we have the ability to do these kind of things, but that's going to raise a huge issue for them of what they're going to do with all the small scale producers that now have no way to make a living, that are dependent on them, millions of producers. Do they just walk away from them? Is that not a reputational risk for those companies? So they're going to have to figure out how to do this. It's going to be ultimately easier to work together. And the other factor here that's important is that on any given day, all the cocoa companies buy from the same producers, because nobody has a dedicated supply chain. They all buy in every single market, and depending on who the aggregators are, they're buying from producers all over the place. They've got to figure out how to raise all the boats, and they can only do that by working together rather than trying to just develop their own individual strategies. Now, I can't remember what the first question. Could you summarize the first question again?
Is it a question again?
It was,
Wait.
So you talked about sustainability is not a competitive issue,
right?
And that you need to share data. One of the problems is that when we talk about in business is that competitive advantage, or that like being able to find the best solution and market it or capitalize on it is like very important to maintaining the best solution out there. So how do you kind of balance that sharing best practices with also ensuring that you don't lose the competitiveness that is the good part about the, I guess, free market?
Right. So I think free market basically is mostly about how you manufacture and what products you make and where you sell them and what your price point is, et cetera, the quality of production that you want. I don't think it's actually about the raw materials that you buy. That's not really a positioning, or it's less and less one. There was a period where sustainability and marketing sustainability was more of an issue. That's becoming much less of one, mostly because consumers aren't willing to pay for that at scale. You know, there's a reason that globally organic production is still below 2%, and is not going to get higher than that, or much higher than that. So I think there is that issue, but I do think there is room for a lot of competition in the sustainability field, and I think we can begin to look at how innovation happens that is relevant to farmers and producers. In the past, they wouldn't share data either, and now they're finding that they're all price takers, so it doesn't really matter. They all need to get better, and they're not going to survive if they don't. But one way that this happens, or could happen, I think, is if we can agree on specific impacts where we need an innovation, and we can use a kind of X Prize type of model to support competitions around solving that problem. But we don't leave it just at the problem solving stage. We also look at the finance side of this. X Prize, after its first, space prize, developed a thing called prize capital, which is written about in a Harvard Business School case, where they pooled venture capital so that the venture capitalists weren't choosing, 32 Black as the horse they were going to bet on in the race. They actually pooled their money and each invested in all of the entrants. And in exchange for that, they had the right to invest in them as they went to market with individual discoveries, even if they didn't actually win the competition. We need to figure out how to turn venture capital into a much more pre-competitive kind of model where you're investing in every horse in the race, because many of the horses are going to produce something that's worthwhile. They may not win the prize, but they're still going to produce something.
Questions? Yes.
One other thing, I think here's something that we're exploring right now, and it gets to maybe that answer from a slightly different point of view. It's very hard for small-scale producers producing commodities and selling them into markets to survive. They simply can't compete with larger-scale, better financed operations. And so the question is, we don't really want to perpetuate poverty. We're not interested in maintaining small farmers just to make sure that category exists and actually is trying to scrape a living together. but can we find hybrid forms of business models where if producers of soy or corn agree to produce their products in a certain way and sell it in a dedicated way to animal protein producers, is there a way we can create an equity position for them within the meat production or the animal protein production unit so that they actually get some of the value that's added to their soy and corn because it's produced in a certain way that can be marketed to get long-term contracts to companies, that companies can actually market as deforestation or conversion free, et cetera. Those are things that I think we could think about as transitional business models that would address some of the poverty and inequality in the value chains that, quite frankly, for most companies, social issues are, including with their producers, are much more important than orangutans in Indonesia.
Hi, I'm Austin. I just want to get your thoughts on the potential for market-based solutions to preserve species that aren't the direct source of a consumer good, like you have with salmon and livestock.
Is there? I couldn't hear. Sorry. Is there
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now?
a species that's different, or what?
Species that aren't the direct source of a consumer good. Is there potential for? Well, we just have like the general loss of biodiversity. Many of these species are not
Right.
like foodstuffs.
Right. So
yeah.
the reason I focus on carbon is because you basically we've seen that payments for environmental services only occur where there's a buyer. There's plenty of sellers for every environmental service in the world, but there aren't any buyers. And so around water in local areas, it's worked really well. We think around soil carbon, it can work really well as well because, in fact, companies buying reduced greenhouse gas emissions or increased organic matter in soil and improved productivity as farmers, that also translates into something that's good for the farmer. We did a study 20 years ago in Brazil that showed that for every half a percentage point of soil carbon that's increased by managing organic matter, producers would reduce by 10% the amount of fertilizer, water, and pesticides they use. All of those are energy intensive and greenhouse gas intensive, and all of those avoided emissions can be sold in the marketplace. That starts to be kind of significant money over time. And the people that are the most interested in the soil carbon are the farmers themselves. So getting paid for this is something that stimulates them to do more of it. We often think of biodiversity in the abstract. Really the biodiversity that might have a good market in the short term is pollinators, because you can see the immediate impact of pollinators on a number of different crops. But biodiversity writ large, I think, is going to be very hard to find ways to pay for.
Hi, Jason. Michael Cohen. Thanks for speaking with us today. I really appreciate it. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned extrapreneurs. I'm wondering if you could touch on their role in a little bit more detail in this system.
So this is something that we were talking about before this talk, and I think that for me, I think entrepreneurs can make a lot of things happen within companies, and they can see how to do things smarter and quicker and better. I think it's hard sometimes for people inside companies to actually see what's coming because they're not given enough time to do that. But more importantly, they don't see what is happening in all of their competitors. The way an outsider who goes in and simply listens more than they talk can actually hear about and then begin to synthesize and see trends that the people that are living those trends don't actually see themselves. And so part of that's what I see my role as, but also good consultants and people like that they can see things that others can take advantage of. And as these pre-competitive platforms get started, business will take this over themselves. They'll there'll be a kind of step change, and then things will stay the same for a while until the next things people begin to look at, and what are the new business models we need to think about, or what are the other types of activities that companies should be looking at. I think it's very hard to do that when your nose is so buried, not just in one particular activity, but in a company's approach. When there are so many companies out there doing so many different things, that if you really want to see what's possible, you need to kind of almost spend your life doing that. And so that's why I think there's a role. Personally, I think the role of NGOs in doing projects around the world is kind of a 20th century thing. The 21st century is actually helping make change happen more quickly. And so that's where I think we actually really need to be going with a lot of our thinking and our work.
Questions?
But it could also be the same for Accenture and BCG and Booz Allen and other consulting firms.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Lexi, and I wanted to come back to your point about the fact that California may no longer be one of the major U.S. agricultural centers. And if we're just sort of thinking in general about displacement of entire industries, there's a lot of things that would go into making that shift. But obviously, there's going to be strong political and cultural implications of that kind of shift as well. And I'm wondering how companies and industries and communities could even begin to have that conversation, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Right. So I think, I guess it's not just the U.S., but that happens to be the country I'm from. So it always strikes me how little we know about our history. California wasn't the supplier of food in the U.S. until about 100 years ago. And it was after the invention of refrigeration to get products from the West Coast and train systems, et cetera, that California became the food production center. And before that, we had a lot more decentralized food production. There was a lot in Michigan. There was a lot in Ohio. There was a lot in New Jersey. It's not called the Garden State for nothing. So we had those pockets. And in some ways, we lost them, I don't think because they were inefficient or even weren't competitive. We lost them because they couldn't produce in the winter. And so it became easier to have one supplier that could supply all year round. And that's when those places began to drop by the wayside. California is going to continue to produce food. It's just that if you look at the mid-delta area, land is $5,000 an acre. If you look at California, it's $20,000 to $25,000 an acre. Labor is more expensive in California, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to produce things, but it's not going to produce a lot of the basic food staples and even basic vegetables that are currently in markets. It's going to have to produce higher end things. It'll produce more artichokes and less lettuce. It'll produce more almonds and less whatever. It only produces cotton now that's very long fiber that can be sold into other markets, high-end markets. It only produces rice that goes almost entirely to Japan where it gets higher prices. The bulk of those things are produced in other places. And I think that's what we're going to see happen with this shift. Once you start putting carbon into food, though, getting things from California to other parts of the country is going to also be more expensive, and the waste rates are going to be higher. We did a little bit of research just looking at romaine lettuce. Today, 80% of romaine lettuce production is left in the field. Another 10% is left in the packing shed because it's not perfect. It doesn't fit 3 to a bag the way it needs to. And so if we're talking about 90% waste, that's a margin that a vertical ag operation in St. Louis or that an outdoor ag in the mid-delta area could begin to compete with.
Hi, Jason. This is Rosie, and this is less of a question, but just interested in hearing more about commodities being produced using illegal labor and what the different forms of illegality that you're referring to are. I wrote down half of food in the U.S. utilizes illegal labor, so I'd just love to hear a little bit more about that.
Right. So there's been some articles and exposés on this recently. In the meatpacking industry in the U.S., surveys suggest that 50% of all labor is illegal. In restaurants, between the people that wash and bus tables, et cetera, it's about 50% of restaurant help, including in the kitchen for prepping, et cetera. In cereal grain, it's lower. It's about 30%. But as farmers get older and as their kids don't want to farm anymore, that is going to probably increase. And in the major fruit and vegetable and areas like that, it's actually in the 50% range. Now, I've interviewed dairy farmers in different places, and they have all the documents, photocopies of all the documents of their labor that are quote unquote legal, but those laborers all leave within a year and 3 quarters, because in 2 years' time is when immigration starts looking at those documents and discovering that they're actually fraudulent. And so there's a constant kind of churn of people moving from one farm to another, et cetera. That's just in the U.S. In other places, it's a lot more about clearing more land than you're legally allowed to. It's about taking water from commons areas where it's limited by law how much you can take, and it's not respected. It's about child labor. It's about slave labor. And the reason I keep talking about can producers make a living, if going back to pick on cocoa in West Africa just for a bit more, the average farmer in West Africa, because of the price of cocoa and their productivity, it averages about 56 cents per day, their income. Now, if you think about that, what price are they going to be able to pay for labor? And you wonder why they have so much child labor, because they can't afford to pay a price. It's the same kind of thing with fishing boats in Thailand that are going out to collect what are called trash fish, or small fish that are ground up and used for making fish meal and fish oil for aquaculture feed. The seas have been so overfished in the South China Sea that they don't get enough of a haul to actually pay labor. And slave labor is very common. People that don't make it off those boats in 3, 4, 5 years. And that's something that now has to be addressed. Those are the kinds of illegality that are kind of all over the place. And then there's the fraud and corruption, the sawdust that's in Parmesan cheese, the olive, 80% of extra virgin olive oil in Italy isn't. Just things like that. If you want to buy extra virgin olive oil that's actually real, buy it from California or Greece. I didn't hear that.
No.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Connor. I was curious about how these pretty competitive organizations or kind of cooperative talks can also potentially impact the governments themselves in these locations. So if small producers aren't necessarily very sustainable over the long run, that might lead to higher unemployment and dissatisfaction among the populace and kind of things like that. So have you seen instances where these have actually helped to strengthen either government regulations or government systems to kind of level the playing field and make things more sustainable in the long run?
Yeah, I think there's two examples. So one is where producers actually proactively work to reduce an impact so that they won't be regulated from the top down without having any involvement. And a really good example of that is in Wisconsin, where we did work with potato growers who were getting complaints from their neighbors that there were pesticides showing up in the water table, and people were drinking from wells and things. Within a period of 6 years, we developed a protocol for measuring toxicity, not just the amount of pesticides, but actually how toxic they were, given their impact on the environment from all the different studies that have been done. Did it with the University of Wisconsin, Wisconsin Extension, and the Wisconsin Vegetable and Potato Growers Association, and came up with a plan that would take what was at that time the average amount of toxicity used and cut it in half, and that would be the new norm. Within 3 years, the producers actually had, for the whole state, cut toxicity by 50%, and they actually made more money because they were using fewer chemicals, but their neighbors liked them better. And more importantly, the regulators saw that they had actually taken it upon themselves to do credible work and produce meaningful results. And so when they wanted to work on water quality and soil health, they went to work with the producers themselves. So there became more of a program where there was a relationship between civil society through NGOs, university producers, and government to come up with the regulations around soil health, around water, etc. So I think those kinds of things are important. And just to show how strange the world can be, the only producers in the state of Wisconsin who couldn't be certified against these new standards were organic producers. And that may seem odd, but here's the reason. Organic producers are allowed to use natural substances, things like rotenone, things like copper, and different metals as pesticides. They're also allowed to use tobacco extracts as pesticides. Those things are far more toxic than many of the chemicals used by others, but organic growers can't give them up because they don't have other things to go to that are less toxic. And so none of them could actually be certified. That's what actually made me kind of pivot how I was thinking about sustainable ag to really looking at toxicity and continuous improvement and reducing the impacts of all systems rather than just trying to say this one is best, go for it.
One more question.
Hi, my name's Amanda Willis. It's a follow-up question to what we were just talking about from a bit of a different angle. What do you think about kind of this idea that pushing pre-competitive collaboration onto businesses could essentially disincentivize people to expect the government to regulate and could lead to longer-term less action on some of these big issues?
So it's interesting. I think there's some phenomena that are going on now that are interesting in this regard. I think the rise of nationalism globally is actually having a severe impact on what governments are willing to regulate. If you look at, or even enforce of current regulations, whether you look at Brazil or Poland or Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. I don't know as much about India or China, and certainly the U.S. So I think there's that issue, but I do think that the promise of the pre-competitive behavior is to actually build consensus about what the key impacts are, and then build coalitions to focus on that, some of which is science. Presumably, hopefully, that's the base, science-based targets, etc. But part of it is also the ability to get civil society and companies to work together to go to government and say, look, in the past we would ask you for things individually, and it was always very political. Well, now we've agreed on some of these things. Let's start moving on them, and it's not a political issue for you because there's agreement. And so I think we can do things that we haven't done in the past, but it's going to require different kinds of alignments and coalitions, et cetera, to do that. And frankly, a government that might be a bit more receptive to hearing about collaboration.
Okay, Jason, with that, we want to thank you very much for taking the afternoon with us. You posted your email up there, so I'm presuming you're okay if people send you questions directly?
Yep, that's absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time. You've given us a lot to think about, and we will keep this idea going as we go through the rest of the semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.